In mid-August 2025, an incident unfolded on the Caspian Sea that Moscow never expected. A Russian-flagged cargo ship, over 120 meters long, was struck while lying at anchor near the port of Olya in Astrakhan. Flames and smoke rose above the waterline as images later showed the vessel half-submerged, its stern slipping under the surface. Kyiv quickly claimed responsibility, insisting the ship carried sensitive military cargo bound from Iran, though many of the details remain unverified. What is certain is that the strike shattered an assumption long held in Moscow, that the Caspian was beyond reach. Was this a one-time attack, or a signal that even Russia's most guarded supply routes are no longer safe? To answer this, we must first examine the vessel itself and the journey it was meant to complete. The story begins with Port Olya 4, a general cargo ship measuring about 123 meters in length and around 16 meters in width, with a deadweight capacity of roughly 5,185 tons. Its gross tonnage is approximately 4,878 GT. Built in 2014, the vessel operates under the Russian flag and is tied to MG Flot LLC, a company already under sanctions for transporting military cargo. Because of its size and capacity, Port Olya 4 is well suited to carry large volumes of parts, machinery, and bulk cargo across the Caspian Sea. It has regularly plied the Iran-Russia route, making stops at ports such as Amirabad in Iran and Olya in Russia, ferrying goods that often escape scrutiny through non-ocean routes. The ship's role is more than logistic. It serves as a link in a military supply chain designed to bypass tighter maritime routes in the south. The route through the Caspian is strategic because it avoids the Black Sea, where NATO, Ukrainian naval forces, and Allied surveillance dominate. Bypassing those contested waters allows Tehran and Moscow to move supplies via inland seas less exposed to Western naval interdiction. In short, Iran uses the Caspian as a safer corridor to help Russia sustain its drone campaigns in Ukraine. Since 2022, Iran has become a key supplier of Shahed-type UAVs to Russia. Dozens, and apparently hundreds, of Shahed drones crossed into Russian use in that period. These unmanned systems, especially Shahed 136 and its relatives, have become a staple in Russia's strategy of continuous drone bombardment. Moreover, some press coverage suggests that Russia is attempting to domestically manufacture drones modeled on Iranian designs, which underscores how essential imports from Iran have been so far. If Kyiv's claims are accurate and Port Olya 4 indeed carried thousands of drone components and ammunition, then that ship symbolized a week of strikes waiting to be launched across Ukraine. The sheer volume of parts, electronics, navigation modules, and rocket warheads aboard would empower Russia to replenish its barrage capability rapidly. Even if some elements are exaggerations, the vessel's sinking alone injects doubt and friction into Russia's supply plan. Politically, the Iran-Russia relationship has deepened under the strains of war. Despite sanctions from the US and European Union, Tehran has agreed to provide drones, missiles, and technical support to Moscow. These actions carry high risk, but Tehran seems willing to endure diplomatic pressure to assert its influence. That cooperation has turned the Caspian route into more than trade. It is now a contested military logistic line. For years, Russia viewed the Caspian Sea as a de facto safe zone, shielded by geography and political control. The Caspian is an inland sea with no direct access to the open ocean, limiting external navy presence and making oversight easier. There is no NATO fleet operating within the Caspian. As such, Moscow treated it as a secure avenue to move supplies into its own territory for war operations. But the attack on Port Olya 4 shattered that assumption. Thus, the vessel's specifications, the route's strategic logic, Iran's drone export role, and the secrecy of the cargo-together frame why Port Olya 4 drew such high stakes. The stage was set for a shock and Ukraine delivered. Next, We will trace how the attack unfolded. The drones in flight, the target struck, and the sequence that led the ship to its watery grave. The strike began like a choreographed operation, not a random raid. Long-range drones lifted off in the pre-dawn hours and flew for hours to reach the Caspian target. Analysts and open sources reported a coordinated sortie of around a dozen to 15 attacking airframes launching from Ukrainian territory and heading east, a mission that required careful timing and navigation across hundreds of kilometers. The type of drone used has not been officially published, yet many experts point to the UJ-26 Bober, or a close derivative, as the most likely candidate, because of its tested range and past use in long-distance strikes inside Russia. The Bober is a Ukrainian long-range loitering munition credited with reaching targets several hundred kilometers inland. Public reporting lists its practical range at roughly 600 to 1,000 kilometers and its warhead in the 20 to 40 kilogram class, figures that match the operational profile required to hit the Caspian anchorage. These drones do not rely on a single navigation method. They use a GNSS/INS hybrid for the mid-course, with electro-optical or thermal sensors for terminal homing when needed. That mix gives resilience against jamming and allows operators to keep a drone on track even when GPS is degraded. In reported strikes like this one, attackers flew low, typically 20 to 60 meters above the sea surface to blend into radar clutter and to reduce detection time for shore-based systems. Published descriptions of the mission note cruising speeds in the 150 to 180 kilometers per hour band, which fits the Bober profile and the mission's 5-hour flight duration. Tactically, the strike looked planned as a multi-axis swarm, not a single-point hit. Sources reporting on the sequence say the attackers split into task groups with specific targets. Some aimed for the engine room and stern to disable propulsion and power, others targeted the bridge and forward compartments to blind command and control, and another set struck midships to open waterlines and break structural frames. 2 additional drones reportedly acted as relays to maintain telemetry and video feeds, and others served as diversionary or barrier blasts to deter rescue craft. This layered plan maximized damage while minimizing the window for an effective emergency response. The mission timeline reported by Ukrainian sources and later corroborated by satellite imagery places launch roughly 5 hours before impact, with the first confirmed strike on the vessel occurring at 10:28 local time. The initial hits struck the aft upper deck and engine ventilation areas, igniting fires that quickly spread through cable trays and fuel lines. Subsequent impacts breached the hull near the waterline and overwhelmed damage control systems. Within minutes, the ship lost main power, emergency systems switched to batteries, and flooding began to cascade through compartments. The chain reaction fire, power loss, pump failure, uncontrolled flooding played out like a sequence of dominoes until the vessel began a severe list and the crew abandoned ship. Details from imagery and open-source investigators back the narrative of progressive, multi-point damage rather than a single catastrophic strike. Satellite photos published in the days after the attack show scorch marks and smoke, and later frames reveal the stern partially submerged alongside the quay with salvage activity nearby. Observers recorded salvage attempts and smoke plumes on the 15th and then further activity on the 19th, consistent with reported rescue and recovery operations. Those images make the difference between claim and confirmation. They show that the ship did not merely suffer superficial damage, but was rendered unseaworthy. From a practical standpoint, the choice of warhead and impact locations mattered. Warheads in the 20 to 40 kilogram bracket produce enough blast and fragmentation to rupture thin deck plating, disable ventilation shafts, and punch holes in hull plates, while multiple timed impacts can breach several watertight compartments before pumps and crew can stabilize the flooding. That is exactly what the strike report describes. A mix of semi-penetrating and fragmentation effects aimed at defeating both the ship's buoyancy and its firefighting capability, which led to an irreversible loss of stability and eventual partial sinking. Finally, the mission exposed a doctrinal shift in Ukrainian options. Long-range, precision swarm strikes can now reach into what were once rear areas and inland seas. Achieving a 5-hour flight, synchronized multi-axis impact, and post-strike telemetry collection shows significant operational maturity. For Moscow, the lesson is raw and immediate. Distance and geography no longer guarantee safety, and supply ships anchoring in presumed sanctuaries can be vulnerable to long-reach kamikaze strikes. With the attack's method and effects laid out, we next assess what this means strategically, how a single sinking can reshape Russia's assumptions about the security of its rear, and the logistics that sustain its campaign. Russia long treated the Caspian Sea region as a secure supply zone, assuming it lay beyond Ukraine's grasp. That assumption now lies shattered. The Port Olya 4 strike demonstrated unambiguously that areas 800 kilometers from frontline zones can be struck with precision. In doing so, Ukraine forced Russia's leadership from naval commanders to political elites to confront a harsh realization: no rear area is immune. Before this event, Moscow relied on the Caspian as a rear corridor free from naval threat. Because the Caspian is landlocked and lacks outside naval presence, Russia believed it could move weapons and supplies with minimal risk. There was no NATO fleet, and Western powers had limited reach into that inland sea. That geographic barrier meant Russia's logistics were safer by default. Yet Ukraine's ability to deliver a swarming drone strike into that zone shattered the illusion of safety. The psychological impact on the Russian side is severe. Crew members aboard future supply vessels must now face fear of distant strikes, and commanders back home must revise their maps of safe zones. Russian officials can no longer dismiss that rear areas are off-limits. In effect, the struck ship's demise forced Russia to admit the war's geography is fluid, and its rear lines are no longer secure. The effects ripple into the maritime insurance sector as well. Insurers now classify Caspian transit as higher risk, pushing premiums upward. Some vessels turn off their AIS, automatic identification system, signals creating dark ship conditions so as not to broadcast their positions to potential attackers. The rise of AIS blackouts or spoofing is already recorded in Caspian traffic, especially among Russian and Iranian flagged vessels, complicating efforts to monitor high-risk movements. The hidden movement of ships undermines transparency and forces all operators to reassess whether maritime routes truly remain dependable. States bordering the Caspian, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Iran must now reassess their security posture. Suddenly, regional waters cannot remain neutral background zones. Countries once passive on Caspian safety are holding emergency maritime security meetings. Coastal capitals are debating whether to expand naval patrols, update rules of engagement, or permit foreign surveillance. The strike has made the Caspian Sea a shared strategic concern. We may draw a comparison with Ukraine's earlier campaign in the Black Sea, where repeated drone and missile attacks made Russian naval bases in Crimea untenable. Over time, Moscow moved many of its ships from Sevastopol to safer ports like Novorossiysk. Reuters. That shift shows how pressure from relatively low-cost unmanned systems can force strategic withdrawal. The Caspian, now subject to the same logic, may become a new front rather than a shielded flank. In short, the strike on Port Olya 4 does more than sink a ship. It shatters the doctrine that geographic distance ensures safety. Russia's rear must now be defended, and that means resources, attention, and vulnerability expand outward. The war's map is evolving, and Russia stands exposed in places it once called secure. Having seen how strategy is reshaped, we now turn to the logistical aftermath, how the strike undercuts Russia's drone supply and amplifies disruption in the Russian war effort. If Kyiv's claim is true, the Port Olya 4 did not carry ordinary freight. It held components that would let Russia field hundreds of Shahed-type strike drones in weeks rather than months. Ukraine says the ship carried avionics, sensors, engines, gyroscopes, and even 122mm rockets, items that are hard to substitute quickly and that directly feed mass UAV production lines. Reuters and other outlets reported Kyiv's assertion on August 14th to 15th, 2025, and linked the vessel to known Iran-Russia cargo routes. To put the scale in plain terms, each operational Shahed pattern drone requires a bundle of parts, an airframe, guidance, and navigation modules, a motor, and a warhead of roughly 40 kilograms. If a single ship truly carried thousands of such components, that consignment would equate to the raw materials for many hundreds of drones, which in turn represent a surge in strike capacity measured in dozens of attacks per night. Analysis by defense think tanks has documented how Russia relied on imported components early in the campaign and then scaled local production. Losing a large concentrated shipment therefore bites deeper than the same volume dispersed across multiple consignments. The warhead math matters because it translates parts into lethal capacity. At about 40 kilograms per drone, a stock of several hundred Shaheds would mean more than 12,000 kilograms of explosive payload could be denied to Russia in one stroke, which has immediate battlefield implications. Fewer ready drones means fewer overnight barrages and a reduced tempo of area denial strikes that have eroded Ukrainian infrastructure and morale. Even a temporary lull in drone sorties gives Ukrainian air defenses and civil systems breathing room to repair and adapt. This is not only a physical hit, it is a strategic rupture in the supply chain logic. Iran and Russia chose the Caspian corridor precisely because it offered lower visibility than air or open sea routes, thereby reducing the risk of interdiction by Western or Israeli forces. Independent analysts and maritime security trackers have documented how small cargo vessels, alternative ports, and AIS manipulation helped shuttle parts across the Caspian while avoiding major checkpoints. The sinking of Port Olya 4 calls that model into question and raises the costs and risks of using the same route again. Beyond the immediate loss of parts, the strike amplifies logistical friction across several dimensions. First, replacement shipments will require more careful routing, transshipment, and deception, which slows delivery times and shrinks the effective output rate of drone factories. Second, buyers and transporters must now factor in higher insurance premiums and the risk of seizures or attacks. Tradewinds and maritime analysts reported early market reactions with salvage and insurance activity visible in the days after August 15th. Third, diplomatic pressure increases as the international community scrutinizes suspected Iran to Russia arms links, which may force covert routes to become even more convoluted. Propaganda and perception effects multiply the operational damage. Even if independent verification of the full manifest remains incomplete, satellite imagery of a burned and partially sunken ship creates a powerful narrative. A single coordinated strike can erase a large slice of Russia's incoming drone inventory. That narrative weakens Moscow's image of secure logistics and strengthens Kyiv's argument that Russia's bombardment capacity can be blunted. Western analysts have noted that such symbolic losses can have outsized effects on planning and morale, forcing adversaries to divert resources into protection rather than production. Finally, the strike exposes a strategic trade-off for Russia: scale versus security. To sustain massive UAV campaigns, Russia needs steady, large deliveries of components or the industrial base to produce them domestically at volume. Recent reporting shows Moscow has expanded local production, but that move depends on foreign components and time to ramp up. The Port Olya 4 loss therefore buys Kyiv not only lost parts but months of delay in replacing them at full strength, and that delay shifts tactical advantage, at least for a limited period, to Ukrainian defenders. With supply lines disrupted and production slowed, the political and diplomatic consequences start to surface from Moscow's initial denials to regional alarm in Caspian states and growing international scrutiny. At first, Russia tried to downplay the damage, calling it a minor incident, and claiming that Port Olya 4 only suffered superficial harm. But satellite imagery and open-source investigators quickly contradicted the narrative, showing smoke, scorched decks, and partial submersion. Moscow then shifted tone, acknowledging damage but refusing to admit full loss, in what many observers see as a tactical move to preserve public confidence. Iran's official silence has been deliberate, avoiding direct confirmation or denial of the vessel's cargo or origin of the strike. Nonetheless, Western media and intelligence sources contend Tehran is deeply unsettled. The sinking threatens to expose its Iran-Russia drone supply pipelines and could invite increased scrutiny and sanctions pressure. Ukraine, by contrast, has cast the event as a symbolic victory. Kyiv's command openly called it a demonstration of reach, emphasizing that the attack underscores Ukraine's capability to strike deep inside Russia. Officials framed the strike not merely as destruction of hardware, but as a message: Russia's rear zones are within reach. In Europe and Washington, the reaction is sharp. US and EU officials note that the incident strengthens claims that Iran is actively supplying Russia with UAV systems used in Ukraine. This supports ongoing diplomatic and sanction efforts aimed at cutting off those supply chains. Some in the West have already called on stricter enforcement of arms embargoes and missile export controls. Meanwhile, Caspian littoral states are sounding alarms. Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and Iran now worry that they may be dragged into conflict zones or become collateral risks. In response, several capitals have called for urgent maritime security meetings, revisions to naval patrols, and diplomatic engagement to preserve freedom of sea lanes in the region. At the global level, the Port Olya 4 incident has become a subject of debate at the United Nations. Russia denounces Ukraine's strike as a breach of international law, while Western nations argue it exposes Iran's violation of arms control commitments. The dispute now threads through Security Council discussions, where some members press for investigations and possible legal consequences. With the political and diplomatic implications clearer now, the final question is how this attack might reshape the war's future and whether Russia can rebuild control over its now vulnerable rear. The strike on Port Olya 4 was not only the loss of a single ship, but also a declaration of strategy. Ukraine showed the world that even the Caspian, once considered unreachable, can be struck with precision. The material damage matters, yet the deeper wound is psychological and political, because every Russian vessel now sails under a cloud of fear. What was once called a safe sea is now a hidden battlefield, and Russia's rear supply routes no longer look secure. By exposing the Iran-Russia axis to international scrutiny, the attack broke the illusion of secrecy and control. The question that remains is sharp. If one vessel could be sunk, what will happen to the entire corridor in the months ahead? Stay with us for more frontline analysis and make sure to subscribe to Military Force so you never miss the next report.